Welcome to Module 4 on Memory in EPY 150 Strategies for Academic Success. Memory is one of my favorite topics, and one of the things I like to do is remind everyone that memory is not a noun, it's a verb. So that means it's a process, not a closet, not someplace we store things. It's really about an activity. And the big idea for this whole chapter is the more actively you use your memory, the better you get at it. Because if you don't use it, your memory doesn't exist. It's about frequency, not duration. So if you forget this, remember verb, not noun. So this image that you see before you is the image of some neurons in the brain. And these lights indicate the activity of the neurons. They are encoding, and it's really chemical activity that contributes to personality, controls behavior, and encodes memory. And one of the big takeaways of this chapter is the more you learn, the more neural networks you build. So that's an important piece of this understanding of memory. And we talk about memory using metaphors. Memory really is a chemical activity in the brain, but we're going to talk about some models of how we understand memory. The first model of memory is the information processing model. This model is not in your textbook, but I have a little image here in front of you to give you an idea of how to understand this. So if you'll notice, there's an input, which is basically, think about everything that you're listening to and hearing and seeing and experiencing right now is the input that is coming into your sensory memory. If you actually pay attention to what's going on around you, it might actually enter your short-term memory. Another name for the short-term memory is working memory. Now notice the little arrow above the short-term memory. That suggests that the more often you practice some kind of rehearsal strategy, the more likely you are to keep the learning active. So for example, if you're in a language class and someone asks you to repeat something out loud, that is in effect a rehearsal strategy. But notice in this model here that long-term memory is this box below short-term memory, but I want you to just think about this as a metaphor, not as a literal place. But I think there's some activity that is indicated by the arrows between the short-term and the long-term memory. The arrow going down from short-term to long-term says encoding, and every time you do something like write notes, in class or as you're reading, that's an encoding strategy. And every time you practice reviewing material within 24 hours, that's a retrieval strategy. And it's only when you practice retrieving things that you actually remember them, because then they go again into your short-term working memory so you can recall them for some useful instance, like, let's say, for example, on a test. Now we're going to talk about a second model of memory that comes from the Dave Ellis textbook. And in the Dave Ellis textbook, he talks about the memory jungle as a metaphor or a way to explain how memory works. So think of this elephant, an elephant in the jungle making a sturdy, well-worn path going back and forth and back and forth. That's the first image. The second image in the memory jungle is a bunch of elephants herding around the water hole. This idea that in order to learn things, we have to chunk pieces of information into groups. So that is kind of a chunking technique that's suggested by this second image of the memory jungle. The third image is actually somebody, you'll notice this woman with a briefcase ignoring the elephant behind her. And that's the idea that sometimes if you turn your back, you won't be paying attention and you won't actually acknowledge the new things that you're learning. But finally, Dave Ellis has a fourth image in the memory jungle about directing traffic. So I have this traffic cop here and a couple of more elephants. So imagine that as you're learning to really actively take care of things. You are directing traffic and organizing information every time you take in new information. So let's summarize this memory jungle idea. Each image is associated with an idea that you, in order to learn something, have to move along a well-worn path. You have to chunk information, not forget, and be actively engaged in your learning. But actually, the key to understanding memory is not just knowing how memory works, but understanding the problems of memory. So The Seven Sins of Memory is a book by Daniel Schachter, who is a psychology professor at Harvard University, who's a specialist in the science and study of memory. And he wrote this book called The Seven Sins of Memory that I think is a really helpful way to look at the problems of memory. So you'll notice on the screen before you I have kind of an outline of the big ideas of his book. So essentially you're getting a book review in a few minutes here in this lecture. He groups the ideas in his book into three ideas. The first three sins of memory he calls sins of omission. These are problems we have in learning and memory when we don't do something. So the first three are called transience, absent-mindedness, and blocking. The next three are sins of commission. So these are ways that we actually actively manipulate memory and problems that arise because of this active manipulation. So 4, 5, and 6 are called misattribution, suggestibility, and bias. And then finally, the seventh sin, according to Daniel Schachter, is persistence, and it is universally bad. So I'm going to be talking to you about what each one of these 7 sins mean, but I want to just caution you that the word persistence here is he uses in a negative light, whereas often we use the word persistence with a positive connotation, like, oh, I'm going to persist means I'm surviving, and that's definitely a good thing. But notice how he uses terms a little bit differently. Okay, so remember, 1, 2, and 3 are sins of omission, problems because something we don't do. So he calls the first sin transience, which basically in his mind means memory lapses over time. We don't remember things that happened a long time ago, or we don't remember everything that happened a long time ago. And those of us who have been on the planet a little bit longer know, after a few years, you don't want to remember everything, right? I'm sure most of us don't remember what we were wearing on October 15th when we were in 3rd grade, right? That would be a weird date to remember. Unless we happen to go to a school where we had a school uniform, we probably don't remember what we were wearing. It's natural. The third sin he calls blocking. And I'm sure everybody has had this experience before, where you get into a test and you go, oh, and you read a question and go, oh, I know this. I have it. But it just seems to not be accessible to you. You know that you know it. It's like it's on the tip of the tongue, but you haven't practiced enough, and so you can't recall the information. He calls this blocking. So again, remember 4, 5, and 6 are sins of commission. They're problems because of our own active manipulation. So misattribution is attributing memories to incorrect sources. So this is a way you could think your professor said X in the lecture when actually your professor said Y, and you'll misremember that information. Number 5 is suggestibility, which is this idea that we actually can get confused. So the whole idea of being able to manipulate people's memory is actually an experience that people have. Like why children don't make great eyewitnesses. Number 6 is the idea that sometimes our beliefs about the past distort our memories. And finally, the seventh one is just really bad. Everybody has it, and that's the idea that we tend to remember things we don't want to remember. Now, in its worst case, we might call this post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's also really the idea that if you go through the day and 10 great things happen to you and one bad thing happens to you, you're going to remember the bad thing. There's something about the way our emotions are engaged with trauma where we tend to remember it a little easier. So these are some of the problems that all of us experience. Now, we can't do everything about all of the traumas in our life, but if we want to improve our learning, the basic solution to memory problems is to practice, 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 and especially to practice within 24 hours of having learned new material. You really do need to review. And this is the big idea to take away. That whole idea of creating a well-worn path and chunking information is you have to review. And now for something slightly different. The power process idea for chapter 3 is called Love Your Problems, Experience Your Barriers. And this really is about noticing where our problems are and not running away from them or not trying to fight them, but to kind of accept them. Not that we accept bad situations and do nothing, but that we see the problems as learning opportunities. We don't tend to learn as much when we're getting everything right. So think about this. What knots are you facing right now? And how can you take a playful, lighthearted, loving approach to the problems instead of just throwing the rubber band ball against the wall, or even worse, walking away from it? Now we're going to look at some memory devices and what we can learn about those. So you'll see a reference to page 116. This is where the article in Becoming a Master Student talks about the mnemonic devices and the difference between an acronym, like Roy G. Biv, and an acrostic, which is a creative sentence, like every good boy does fine. So definitely go back and review that article so that you can know the difference between some of these mnemonic devices, which are great techniques for helping you remember things. They don't necessarily help you understand a concept, but they definitely help you remember something in need, especially in a test-taking situation. So try them out. You'll notice on page 106 to 111, there's some great memory techniques. So I want you to review this article and ask yourself, what could you try this week that's different? What are your ideas about memory techniques and study aids? Look closely. Now, as we're wrapping up this lecture for Module 4, I want you to just take a moment, wherever you're sitting or lying down, and just practice being in the present moment. I have this pretty image of a sunflower before you. So you should have noticed from reading the article about memory techniques that relaxation is one of the keys to helping improve your memory, because we don't remember things when we're stressed out. So take a pause, take a deep breath in through your nose and out. Don't make a big deal out of anything that's going on. Just notice how your body feels. Notice your breath. Notice your surroundings. Relax your shoulders and take in the moment as it is. Practice being in the now. Letting go of all your problems, any issues you're facing, and just taking a moment to breathe in through your nose and out. In through your nose and out. There's something good about just breathing and being in the now. This is a reminder that the next section, the next module, will be reviewing and getting ready for Exam 1. Start studying for Exam 1.